Hi, I'm Stephanie Vecchio, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 11 in our History Bites series. Today we are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and we'll be discussing women's suffrage and the fight for the right to vote. The fight for women's suffrage began in earnest in the decades before the Civil War. During the 1820s and 30s, most states had extended the franchise to all white men, regardless of how much money or property they had. At the same time, all sorts of reform groups were proliferating across the United States: temperance leagues, religious movements, moral reform societies, anti-slavery organizations, and in many of these, women played a prominent role. But women's suffrage truly advanced in 1848. In 1848, a group of abolitionist activists met in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss the problem of women's rights. They were invited there by the reformers and leaders Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Most of the delegates to the Seneca Falls Convention agreed. American women were autonomous individuals who deserved their own political identities. "We hold these truths to be self-evident," proclaimed the declaration of sentiments that the delegates produced, "that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." What this meant, among other things, was that they believed women should have the right to vote. Seneca Falls was followed in 1850 by the first National Convention of the Women's Movement, held in Worcester, Massachusetts, by Lucy Stone and a group of prominent Eastern suffragists. Lucy Stone was a pioneer in the women's suffrage and rights movement, having been passionate about the cause since she was a child, even retaining her maiden name upon marriage. Another convention, held in Syracuse, New York, in 1852, was the occasion of the first joint venture between Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the dynamic suffragist pioneer and leader Susan B. Anthony. Together, these two figures led the American suffragist movement for the next 50 years, working and fighting together steadily for women's suffrage. In 1872, after Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting in the general election, a lawyer named Henry R. Selden defended Anthony when she was declared incompetent by the courts simply for being a woman looking to defend herself. Our local town of Selden is named after Henry. Selden believed that Anthony had the right to vote and said this when she was arrested: "In my opinion, the idea that you can be charged with a crime on account of voting or offering to vote when you honestly believed yourself entitled to vote is simply preposterous, whether your belief were right or wrong." During the 1850s, the women's rights movement gathered steam, but lost momentum when the Civil War began. Almost immediately after the war ended, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution raised familiar questions of suffrage and citizenship. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, extends the Constitution's protection to all citizens and defines citizens as male. The 15th, ratified in 1870, guarantees Black men the right to vote. Some women's suffrage advocates believed that this was their chance to push lawmakers for truly universal suffrage, but they would have to wait 50 more years for their right to vote. It was understood that an amendment to the Constitution would be required in order to secure the vote for women. Accordingly, the National Woman Suffrage Association was formed in 1869 with the declared object of securing the ballot for women by an amendment to the Constitution. Anthony and Stanton were the leaders of this organization, which held a convention every year for 50 years after its founding. In 1869, another organization, the American Woman Suffrage Association, was founded by Lucy Stone with the aim of securing women's suffrage by obtaining amendments to the effect in the constitutions of the various states. In 1890, the two organizations united under the name National American Woman Suffrage Association and worked together for almost 30 years. Instead of arguing that women deserved the same rights and responsibilities as men because women and men were created equal, the new generation of activists argued that women deserved the vote because they were different from men. When Wyoming entered the Union in 1890, it became the first state whose constitution accorded women the right to vote. Subsequently, vigorous campaigns were conducted to persuade state legislatures to submit their voters amendments to state constitutions conferring full suffrage to women in state affairs. Efforts were also made to give women the right to vote in presidential elections and, in some states, the right to vote in municipal and local elections. In the next 25 years, various individual states yielded to the movement's demands and enfranchised their women. Each such state increased the members of Congress elected partly by women. These members were thus at least partly obliged, by the nature of their constituency, to vote for a women's suffrage amendment to the United States Constitution. By 1918, women had acquired equal suffrage with men in 15 states. Starting in 1910, some states in the West began to extend the vote to women for the first time in almost 20 years. Idaho and Utah had given women the right to vote at the end of the 19th century, but there was still work to be done in the East and the South. In 1917, years after the deaths of Stanton and Anthony, Alice Paul founded the National Women's Party. Paul was a well-educated Quaker who studied in England and became involved in the suffrage movement there. When she returned to the United States, she renewed her passion for women's suffrage and founded the NWP. The party focused on slightly more radical tactics than the people before them, taking part in hunger strikes and White House pickets. In 1922, after the amendment was ratified, Paul reorganized the NWP with the goal of eliminating all discrimination against women. In 1923, Paul wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, and launched what would be for her a lifelong campaign to win full equality for women. The National Women's Party is still doing important work to this day. World War I and the major role played in it by women in various capacities broke down most of the remaining opposition to women's suffrage in the United States. Amendments to the federal constitution concerning women's suffrage had been introduced into Congress in 1878 and 1914, but the 1878 amendment had been overwhelmingly defeated, and the 1914 amendment had narrowly failed to gain even a simple majority of the votes in the House of Representatives and the Senate. A two-thirds majority vote in Congress was needed for the amendment to be sent to the legislatures for ratification. By 1918, however, both major political parties were committed to women's suffrage, and the amendment was carried by the necessary two-thirds majorities in both the House and Senate in January 1918 and June 1919, respectively. Vigorous campaigns were then waged to secure ratification of the amendment by two-thirds of the state legislatures, and on August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. On August 26th, the 19th Amendment was proclaimed by the Secretary of State as being part of the Constitution of the United States. Women in the United States were enfranchised on an equal basis with men. The text reads as follows: "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." While so many of us know the names Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and numerous others, it is vital to remember Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and Mary Church Terrell, just three African American women who fought against slavery as well as women's rights. Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Baumfree, was born a slave in New York in 1797, but after gaining her freedom went on to become a preacher and strong abolitionist, ultimately fighting for human rights as long as she lived. In 1851, at the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, Truth gave possibly the most well-known abolitionist and women's rights speech in history, called Ain't I a Woman? Ida B. Wells was a journalist, teacher, researcher, and activist. Born into slavery in Mississippi in 1862, Wells enrolled in college after the Civil War. She later went on to become a teacher in order to support her siblings, having lost their parents to a yellow fever epidemic, and soon after began to write investigative articles on lynchings. She had her life continually threatened, having to leave her home with her siblings to survive. Despite being ostracized by white women in the suffrage movements, as she often called on these women to speak out against lynchings and the treatment of African Americans, Wells fought hard for women's rights. She helped found the National Association of Colored Women's Club and was present at the founding of the NAACP. Mary Church Terrell was a highly accomplished and educated woman and was the first Black woman to be appointed to the District of Columbia Board of Education in 1895. She was born in Memphis, Tennessee, to former slaves and was educated in Ohio. She was an activist for women's rights and racial equality, helping to form the Federation of Afro-American Women, and became the first president of the newly formed National Association of Colored Women's Club. She also co-founded the NAACP and the influential Delta Sigma Theta sorority. With Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, she and her daughter picketed the White House in support of adoption of the 19th Amendment. After World War I, she was a delegate to the International Peace Conference and was elected president of the Republican Women's League during President Harding's administration, the first presidential election in which all American women could vote. In 1920, the National League of Women Voters was founded. The League was officially founded in Chicago just 6 months before the 19th Amendment was ratified and women won the vote. Formed by the suffragists of the National American Women Suffrage Association, the League began as a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. The League is still highly active today, advocating for voters' rights and helping to educate voters and citizens before, during, and after elections. However, while women won the right to vote in 1920, women of color and many people of color still did not have full voting rights. Poll taxes and literacy tests deliberately kept African Americans from fully participating in democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Denial of citizenship, property requirements, and sanctioned violence against Native Americans barred them from the polls. Literacy tests were used to disenfranchise racial minorities as late as 1970. Voting rights are still a hot-button issue in the United States and around the world. Despite the current discussions over the Voting Rights Act, we cannot and will not forget the women who fought so hard for the right to vote and remain grateful for their strength and ability to press on, even when so many were against them. Today and every day, we celebrate women's suffrage. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click like, and if you watched on YouTube, please hit subscribe. Thank you so much, and we will see you all next time.